Welcome and Jai Janendra to all of you who are joining us today for the inaugural UCI Jain Studies lecture, as well as the first lecture in the series Religious Studies and Producing Alternate Futures. My name is Brianne Donaldson and I hold the chair in Jain Studies here at UCI in Religious Studies and Philosophy. I want to extend a special welcome to my students who are exploring Jainism this quarter in our Theory and Methods class. And I also want to note the interdisciplinary organizations that are co-sponsoring this UCI Humanities event, demonstrating, I think, the far-reaching importance of including global religious philosophies and practices to engage persistent questions of personal, social, and ecological expansion. These include UCI Religious Studies, UCI's Center for the Study of Cannabis, the Department of Philosophy, the Center for Medical Humanities, and also Loyola Marymount University's Department of Theological Studies and Yoga Studies program, who are also co-sponsoring today's event. Many thanks also to our behind-the-scenes crew who bring these events to reality. That's Dwayne Pack in IT, Michelle Spivey and Mark Kunda in Religious Studies, and Lilibeth Garcia in Communications. Thank you all. And I want to warmly welcome any members of the Jain community who are joining today in the US or around the world. Just to note that today's lecture and the Q&A is being recorded, and the registered attendees will receive a link for the video in the next few days. So each of us is attending today's event, and we are each located in a specific place with its own social and ecological histories. In lieu of a land acknowledgement, which I've been thinking a lot about over the last while, and what it means to know something about the complex entanglements and the histories of the places that shape and hold our present lives, I want to share these two interactive maps with you. These are both maps of North America, where you can put in a zip code for where you are today, or where you've been in the past, and discover something about the indigenous communities, as well as that tenacious flora and fauna that have lived and often still live in the many places that we're joining from today. Michelle, if you could drop those links in the chat, that'd be great. Thank you so much. Since Jainism is also considered by scholars to be an ancient indigenous tradition in South Asia, now with thriving communities around the world, including here in Southern California, I've asked Sushama Parekh on behalf of the North American Jain community to offer the Namakar mantra, which is the most auspicious way to begin any Jain-related event. Sushama Parekh has been working in the aerospace industry for over 40 years, currently as principal engineer at Moog Incorporated. She's an adjunct professor at Claremont School of Theology, offering classes in Jain studies, and is member of the Federation of Jain's Associations in North America, or JAINA, where she is the director of the Academic Liaison Committee concerned with promoting the study of Jainism in North American academic institutions. I'll put a slide up with a translation of the Namakar mantra as it's being recited. Welcome, Sushama Parekh.
Thank you. Om Namo Arihantanam. Om Namo Sitanam. Om Namo Ayariyanam. Om Namo Uvajayanam. Namo Doe Sovasahuram. Eso Panchanamakaro. Sovapava Panasano. Mangalanancha Sovesim. Padamam Havai Mangalam. Padamam Havai Mangalam. Jai Jinendra. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sushma. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Tyrus Miller, Dean of the UCI School of Humanities, for a brief word of welcome from UCI. Dean Miller, welcome.
Thank you, Brianne. I'm pleased to be able to welcome you all here to this 2021 Jain Studies lecture. Others will be giving an introduction to our speaker and participants today. So I will do something that does not come natural to me, which is to be brief, but I will say a few words about our endowed Jain chair here at UCI and Professor Brianne Donaldson, who holds the Shri Parshvanath Presidential Chair in Jain Studies. So first about the endowed chair itself. It was created in 2018 through the generous donations of Doctors Meera and Jaswant Modi and their children, Dr. Rushab and Shruti Modi and family, Mr. and Mrs. Rajesh and Nita Shah and their children, and Avani and Akash Shah and family to compose a $1.5 million endowment. This was supplemented by the UC presidential match for endowed chairs with an additional $500,000 of endowment. The intention of the chair was to support instruction and research in the study of Jainism, its historical traditions, and its living heritage here at UCI and in connection with our surrounding community. We are grateful for the enrichment of our cultural and scholarly dialogue that this endowment represents. Professor Donaldson came to UCI in 2019 to take up this presidential chair. Her work is especially oriented towards applied ethics, in particular, ways in which key tenets and traditions of Jainism, such as the foundational principle of ahimsa or nonviolence, resonate with and may help inform very contemporary issues, debates, and practices, such as veganism, animal rights, and/or other ways of conceiving of ethical treatment of animals, animal experimentation, or to mention an issue which came very much to the fore during the pandemic, which I had the opportunity to discuss at length in one of our School of Humanities video conversations, the ethics or lack thereof of industrial animal food production. Professor Donaldson's courses and the programming that she has brought to UCI represent new perspectives and engagement in critical bioethical issues and enrich the dialogue between Jainist principles and other philosophical and spiritual traditions. So I'll now yield our virtual podium to the main participants with a welcome to them all and to our audience this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dean Miller. I appreciate those words. Thank you. And finally, I'd like to ask Dr. Christopher Key Chapple to offer a word of welcome on behalf of Loyola Marymount University, who's co-sponsoring today's event across institutions. Dr. Chapple is the Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology and the Director of the Masters of Arts in Yoga Studies at LMU. Welcome, Dr. Chapple.
Thank you, Brianne. And I feel at a distance in the company of friends. I want to celebrate the thick fog as I gaze out what normally would be to a view of the Santa Monica Mountains, the indigenous lands of the Tongva people. And as I reflect on this tradition, this Jain tradition of tenderness, of gentleness, of attentiveness, and generosity, I'm also mindful of the work of both Brianne and Anne in the company of the many good women who have embraced the fantastic principles of this ancient faith and lifted them up for the world to see them, both as they were, as they are currently, and raising prospects as we move forward with these teachings of ahimsa, and particularly aparigraha, of not identifying with our possessions. Anne's book, Guardians of the Transcendent, tells the remarkable story of living in a community of Jain nuns in Rajasthan for many, many months and learning the minutiae, learning the particulars of how to practice a nonviolent lifestyle and problematizing it, saying, how can this be possible? What are the implications? And as a professor, she has carried on with this work, examining contemporary Jain communities in Canada. And by looking at the shift of consciousness that comes with the tenderness of the attunement to a nonviolent lifestyle, and Brianne, Sushma, so many have elevated discourse throughout the globe. It's an honor to introduce Anne on behalf of our own program here at Loyola Marymount, where we bring our graduate students to study in India, either via Zoom, usually in person, and to interact, as has Anne, with these remarkable communities committed to the life of nonviolence. So I'm grateful to Brianne, to UCI for hosting this, and really honored to be invited to co-sponsor through theological studies and the program in yoga studies here at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chapple. And now to our guest speaker. Anne Vallely is Associate Professor of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada. She focuses on Anthropology of Religion with a primary focus on South Asian traditions, especially Jainism. Her multiple articles and book focus on Jain and South Asian views on ecology, human and non-human boundaries, gender, death rituals and mourning, asceticism and the body, spirit possession, and women's religious lives. She also regularly offers and oversees a summer study trip in India with a focus on Jainism. Secondarily, Dr. Vallely is interested in the field of contemplative studies, pedagogy, and contemporary Judaism. More recently, she is the founding member of the Academy of Mindfulness and Contemplative Studies and the founder of the Psychedelics and Spirituality program, both at the University of Ottawa. As we begin, please note that you can click on the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in a question throughout the presentation as it comes to mind. Dr. Daniele Piomelli of the UCI Center for the Study of Cannabis will moderate our discussion after the presentation and field as many of your questions as possible. And Vallely, on behalf of UCI and LMU, welcome.
Thank you so much. And you'll let me know if you're having any difficulty hearing me. So Jain, thank you so much for having me. I want to thank UCI School of Humanities for the invitation. I want to thank Key Chapple for that lovely introduction, and Brianne as well for that introduction. So it's really an honor for me to be here, coming from traditional land of the Anishinaabe people, unceded territory. The cold north of Canada in Ottawa is where I'm coming into you tonight. I just want to thank you for this introduction. And really, I was thinking that a few months back when Dr. Donaldson, when Brianne invited me to give a talk in this forum, she asked, would I speak on the topic of Jainism and psychedelics? And this at the time seemed to me absolutely irresistible. My entire academic career up until now has been happily ensconced within Jain studies. But over the past couple of years, it has expanded to include psychedelic studies. And now I do find myself as director of the Psychedelics and Spirituality Studies at the University of Ottawa, and I'm currently building an interfaculty religion and psychology master's degree in psychedelics and consciousness studies with a colleague, Dr. Monica Williams, in psychology at the University of Ottawa. But this work has felt like a bit of a detour. And I never actually thought that I would be speaking on this topic of Jainism and psychedelics under that single umbrella. So it was irresistible, but it also felt a little bit transgressive, actually, given Jainism's restrictions really on what counts and what doesn't count in terms of consumption, and on the Jain principle of ahimsa and the fact that all plants are sentient and alive. I'm going to share screen with you, so you're not just looking at me for this. Here we go.
Looks great, Anne.
You got that? Great.
Yes.
So we don't have anything like soma, the celebrated plant mentioned in the Rig Veda, assumed by many to be a psychedelic because of its amrita or immortality conferring properties. We have nothing like that, as far as I know, within Jainism. We also don't have anything like ethnographic data of a Jain psychedelic subculture, as we do, right, with Buddhism. While this group is for many an anathema to those within an orthodox lineage-based Buddhist tradition, they nevertheless exist, right? In fact, the leaders of some of the early psychedelic movement in the 1960s were in fact American Buddhists. We don't have anything like this within the tradition of Jainism to justify a talk or a lecture or a program on psychedelics and Jainism. But I don't want to overdetermine this. In fact, there may be Jains in the audience, and so it will be interesting afterwards to have a conversation. But I find it difficult to imagine psychedelics ever being integrated into Jain practice. And I'll move the slide. Mendicant or householder practice, because of their restrictions on food consumption in particular, governed, of course, by ahimsa or nonviolence. These rules are very strict for the mendicants, and the householders modeled themselves after the mendicants. So consuming psychedelics would be treated as certainly unnecessary violence and likely as intoxicants, which could inhibit the vigilance that one ought to bring to govern movements, the body's movement. So here we just see an exchange of food and a bhiksha exchange, not exchange of food, but of giving of food from householders to mendicants. So for all of these reasons, I demurred somewhat and proposed to Brianne a less striking title, the title of Jainism and Non-Ordinary States of Consciousness, because in fact, that is the broader category that many of us are fascinated about exploring. Those states of consciousness that are distinct from everyday ego-driven waking consciousness that can bring insight, openness, experience of compassion, and the experience of plenitude as well. These insights may develop over years of contemplative practice, of yoga, of centering prayer, dance. They may happen through deity visualizations, or they may happen when those machinations of the conceptual mind are defeated as a result of, for instance, koan practice, or they may result from being catalyzed by a psychedelic. They share in common a transcendence of ego consciousness and a glimpse, perhaps, of another way of being, another way of knowing. So even though at face value, the research fields of Jainism and psychedelics seem to have very little in common, by broadening our frame, by broadening the scope, I think that there can be a very fruitful dialogue. And indeed, beyond the surface level, beyond these surface level differences, there's actually striking and deep congruences between psychedelically catalyzed transcendent states and those cultivated through Jain practice, including radically non-anthropocentric ontologies and deep ecological consciousness, and the reverence for a multiplicity of life. So I'm not assuming in this presentation, I'm not assuming that the audience already has a background on Jainism or a background on psychedelic studies. So what I'm planning on doing in the next half an hour or so is actually to do four things. First, to provide a bit of a background on Jainism. Second, to provide a bit of a background on psychedelic studies. And then I'd like to make an argument for the humanities, and in particular for religious studies, to stake a claim in this emerging space of psychedelic studies, or in particular, non-ordinary states of consciousness. I believe it's the discipline's birthright. Finally, I want to suggest that the insights that we gain or that we can learn from the Jain tradition are actually particularly valuable in helping to inform what's called the set and setting of psychedelic experiences, the mindset that one goes into for the experience. But even more importantly, in the crucial post-journey period of integration, where the experiences have the opportunity of being translated into a meaningful aspect of one's life, rather than simply being an extraordinary one-off experience whose relevance will diminish with time. In order for there to be personal integration of experiences in a pro-social way, and in turn, in order for there to be a societal integration of new insights, I believe that we need to broaden the field of psychedelic studies to include the humanities. Okay. Jainism, or Jain Dharma, as it's called, is an ancient non-theist tradition with its origins in India, dating back perhaps as early as the 9th century before Common Era, as part of what's called the Shramana civilization. Shramana meaning self-effort, and it's what distinguishes it from the Vedic civilization. So Shramana civilization does not recognize any creator God. So one must, on one's own effort, strive for liberation. So Jainism would be part of the Shramana civilization or Shramana movement that includes other non-theistic groups, including its younger cousin, Buddhism. The ideas in the Shramanic movement are similar to the later Upanishads. All of these are soteriologies, right? They all seek salvation. These are systems that identify our ordinary relationship to the world as deeply flawed and the source of so much suffering to others, but ultimately to ourselves. All identify that egoic mind, that incessantly critical, neurotic, chattering self as the source of the problem. Whereas it's well known that Buddhism identifies the mind, this mind as ground zero, as both foe and friend, as the source of our suffering, but also the source of our alleviation. Jainism concurs with this, but its focus lies elsewhere. Its focus is on ahimsa, on nonviolence. So according to Jainism, each and every one of us is in possession of an eternal, conscious, and compassionate dimension, which is called a jiva, or a soul. The jiva suffers, incarcerated as it is in a limited, empirical, alienated, karma-driven self. It yearns for freedom. And this is true for all living beings. Human beings have an awareness of this, and this alone is our advantage over other beings. But all share the same condition and all yearn for release. Jains assert that anything that we do that's contrary to our true self, this primordial self, anything that's contrary to that is violence. This would include, of course, harming others, since our nature is nonviolent. It would also include indulging our senses. Anything that would be ego-driven would also be contrary to our true nature, taking us away from that primordial nature, and therefore violence. Jainism is renowned for its ascetic ideal and its ethic of absolute nonviolence. Arguably, the tradition has devoted more attention to the theory and practice of nonviolence than has any other religious philosophy. It's commonly encapsulated in the aphorism Hinsa Paramo Dharma, which states nonviolence is the supreme or paramount duty or religion or path. Jains are known for the expansiveness of this concept of ahimsa, of nonviolence. It extends far beyond the human community to include all living beings, and important for our discussion, plants as well. It censures not only physical violence, but also harmful speech and injurious thoughts. That also draws in negative karma. That's also a form of violence. The religious heroes of the Jains are the renouncers, those male and female mendicants who have given up all attachments to worldly life to dedicate their lives to nonviolence. Less well known are Jainism's contemplative teachings, even though these are deeply relevant to the tradition's renunciatory practices and ethical ideals. Jainism possesses ancient teachings, elaborate introspective practices aimed at the goal of transcendence, a word that's called keval gyan or paramatma, a complete detachment from worldly existence. Many of these practices predate both Buddhist, meditative, and Hindu yogic traditions, but have received relatively little scholarly attention, with really a notable exception to the work of Christopher Chappell here on this Zoom call. He's one of the exceptions, actually, who has devoted extensive work in this area on Jainism. But most scholarship on Jainism, including my own, has centered on the tradition's rigorous asceticism, its ethic of nonviolence, its philosophy, social history, distinctive temple architecture. And from the Jain perspective, of course, all of these observables are ultimately significant only to the extent that they point back to this fundamental reality of a jiva, of a soul, in its ontological isolation. The jiva is eternal, it seeks release, it never merges with a god, right? This is a non-theistic tradition. There's no Atman Brahman kind of equation that we find within the Upanishads in Jainism. It's, again, ontological aloneness. The experience of the witness self, Jains claim, so attaining this witness self is something that we can achieve. It's knowable, and it's knowable through introspective practices that lead to heightened non-ordinary states of consciousness that include compassion and bliss. The conviction of a spiritual dimension to life comes from practice and experience and can be cultivated according to Jainism. The conviction of this reality is really nowhere better demonstrated than in Jainism's end-of-life practices. Here we have the next slide. In a practice called sanlekana, or sometimes referred to as santara, which is a deliberate, fully conscious renunciation of the body for the sake of the soul, right? It's this idea at the end of one's life, when one is very ill or very near death, one gives up the body rather than a frantic attachment to life, which is what we typically see in our society. There's renunciation of the body. Again, Christopher Chappell has written extensively on this topic, and I'm sure that he would agree with me, as I've also been interested in this and have studied this quite extensively in terms of ethnographic work. And I've had the honor, I would say, the honor of seeing a number of these rituals of Sanleikana. And it's really awesome to behold, in that true sense of awesome. Watching these individuals at the end of their life, their endings in full consciousness, full awareness. They're not in a state of delirium. They have attained at certain times during this ritual non-ordinary states of consciousness. They're calm. They embrace death without fear at all. It's really quite striking. It's quite remarkable. And I think that if I were to locate my initial interest in psychedelics, it actually came from this juncture here around this issue of around death within the Jain tradition, and seeing the way in which Jains who undertake this fast really are able to enter into a period of insight. So rather than the dying process being a decline and leading towards annihilation, Jains can understand it, and we see that actually in these rituals of Sanleikana. It's a period of insight as well. So I do locate my own interest in psychedelics here because I had been studying death and dying within the Jain context for a lot of years. And as I said, I had been witness to this extraordinary practice, and it's extraordinary also in the Indian context. It's important to mention that. It's not as though all Jains are embarking on Sanleikana. That would not be the case. But while I was studying Jain practices of death and dying, my own father became ill. And now this is a full 10 years back. And he became ill for a short period. He had a very aggressive cancer that took him in a matter of weeks. But I saw a glimpse of the opposite from the Santara ideal, where the norm here, and this was in Montreal at the time, was one of depression and anxiety, and antidepressant and anti-anxiety medications were the norm on everybody's tray in the palliative care ward. So my own father was a fervent, zealot atheist, and a very articulate one. He was very articulate until this period in his life, where he became actually very inarticulate as he struggled to give expression to some kind of hope or some kind of meaning beyond his dying, diseased body. And the only language that he had available to him came from religion. Any kind of, transcendent language that was available to him came from religion, which he vehemently rejected. So his efforts at this, they were over before they started, really. It was a kind of foreclosure on that possibility. So it wasn't actually until after this time, maybe a year later after my father died, that I came upon the research at Johns Hopkins University and New York Medical School using psychedelics for end-of-life despair. And I remember thinking that, had we had this opportunity, it would have been extraordinary. But I also felt that it's not just in a personal case, not just in my father's case, but perhaps for our society. I felt that for our secular, or perhaps a better word would be desacralized society, unwilling as we are to embrace the kind of religious certitudes that I have been experiencing in the Jain context in India, and very tight-knit religious Orthodox communities. As a society, we're not willing to do that. I thought for this society, perhaps these psychedelic psychotherapies are exactly what we need. They seem to be providing people with something akin to what the Jain tradition is providing through its meditative techniques. So I organized a workshop in 2018 at the University of Ottawa entitled Psychedelics and Transcendence at the End of Life. And Dr. Anthony Bosses, who is a key researcher in this field, gave the keynote address. And that really got me started. So it's really been that time that I've taken an interest in this field. Okay. We are hearing a lot these days about being in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance. I just wanted to say a word about words, about terminology here. And I'm using the language of psychedelics. Psychedelic itself is a neologism made up of two Greek words meaning mind manifesting. It's not universally embraced. There are other terms as well. Entheogens denotes the sense of enlivening the divinity or enlivening God within. That's another term that's not universally embraced at all, but nevertheless a popular term. There's the language of plant medicines. Many indigenous communities use that language. And of course, when they do, they're referring to medicine in that holistic sense. The language of hallucinogens is also still used, certainly in the literature, in the medical literature, and drugs is a term that's bantered around an awful lot. It's widely used. It's the term that's used by the FDA. It's a term that's used by the Office of Controlled Substances in Canada, in Health Canada. But these substances, whatever they are, these plant medicines do not behave the way most pharmaceutical medications behave. Right? Individuals are not passive recipients of a substance that works on some biochemical level far beneath their conscious awareness. Quite on the contrary, actually, they're active participants in their own healing. And their healing comes about largely dependent on their subjective states. So the terminology remains challenging, but the reference of psychedelic renaissance actually centers or captures that notion of a return to research that had been vibrant in the pre and post World War II period, right up until the 1970s, when psychedelics hastily, very rashly, were categorized as Schedule I drugs. So a designation for substances that have a very high likelihood for abuse, that are highly toxic, and that have no medical value. So this restricted not just recreational use of psychedelics, but they also became unavailable for any kind of clinical research. Dozens of active research programs came to a halt at this time in the 1970s. The move to place these non-addictive and therapeutically highly valuable substances in that restrictive category was not coming out of science. It was not grounded in science. We now know that it was politically motivated, given the association of psychedelics with counterculture and the opposition to the Vietnam War, for instance. There has been an easing on restrictions since the late 1990s. And just move my slide. And this has continued. So now when we're talking, we can talk about this renaissance denoting this resurgence or revival of clinical-based, evidence-based, or scientific research. Now, after a 40-year hiatus, research on the therapeutic potential of psychedelics is being actively renewed in clinical, neuroscientific, and pharmaceutical settings around the world at a lot of prestigious universities in the US, but also in the UK, primarily, right, for mental health outcomes, for OCD, for opiate addictions, tobacco addictions, alcoholism, for PTSD, anxiety, and of course also for end-of-life existential anxiety. Major clinical trials have been underway with remarkable outcomes, and in 2019, Imperial College in London established the world's first formal center for psychedelic research, focusing on its clinical applications, and many, many have followed since. So my question now is, what does religion have to do with any of this? And really the answer is an awful lot, as it turns out, an awful lot. You know, one of the most striking features of the current renaissance in psychedelic research is the degree to which attention is being drawn, once again, to spirituality and to spiritual experience, as it was in the 1960s. The vocabulary of the sacred, of awe, of the ineffable, mystical, even the language of God, terms that have traditionally been the province of theologians, chaplains, religious studies scholars, are now routinely invoked by clinicians and neuroscientists in the context of clinical research. So in 2006, Dr. Roland Griffiths, who's a remarkable advocate for psychedelic research, a kind of superstar actually in this field, professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, wrote, psilocybin can reliably occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. So again, coming from a psychiatrist. And in the study that he conducted in 2006, 2/3 of the participants considered the psychedelic experience to be among the most important events of their life. That's a big deal, 2/3 of the participants. They described a feeling of being in the presence of something authentic, something knowledgeable, that noetic quality that we identify with mystical states, powerful and compassionate. The psychologist Ralph Metzner, the professor of psychiatry Charles Grob, described psychedelic therapy as a form of applied mysticism. James Fadiman, a psychologist and pioneer in psychedelic studies for the last 4 decades, unambiguously describes psychedelic experiences as religious. More recently, the clinical psychologist Anthony Bossis has argued that psychedelic therapies have as much to do with spirituality as with pharmacology. So, given this, one might expect to have religious studies scholars and theologians busily writing up grant applications, launching research projects, but this hasn't happened yet. And this is one of the interesting things, and I guess I think of this presentation or this conversation as making a case for this, or making an argument for the need for this. And the reason is that there remains a taboo, a real taboo, around investigating the non-medicinal uses of psychedelics, as there was in the first wave as well. So in 1964, the celebrated historian of religion, Huston Smith, made a provocative claim. He said that psychedelically induced experiences are phenomenologically identical to religiously endorsed, theologically grounded ones. He labeled them psychedelic theophanies. But Smith's invitation to take psychedelic research seriously was largely ignored by mainstream faith communities, by theologians, and by religious studies scholars. R.C. Zahner, a professor of Eastern religions at Oxford University, did respond with a book on mysticism, sacred and profane, and it was a very critical book of Huston Smith and the idea that we could compare mystical experiences from psychedelics with authentic mystical experiences. And in particular, he was talking about Christian mysticism. Similarly, Stephen Katz, a professor of Jewish and Holocaust studies at Boston University and known for his work on mysticism, writes, mystical experiences, in other words, authentic mystical experiences, are engagements with an external reality. When you take a pill, your brain does funny things and you have a funny brain experience. You haven't had a mystical experience, you've had a psychological experience. And then he concludes, psychology is not the same thing as metaphysics. Okay, so this is a common kind of response, right? So religious studies is far more at ease with the historical, sociocultural, and linguistic study of religion than it is with first-person experiential accounts. The whole field, in fact, of contemplative studies was born out of this frustration with this approach. It emerged with the express intention of studying the world's religious traditions as repositories of ancient wisdoms, as vast spectrums of mind states that can be studied experientially and harnessed for pro-social, creative, and therapeutic ends. Interest in non-medicinal uses of psychedelics remains controversial, stigmatized, even seemingly degenerate in some way. It's so, again, being invited to talk on it was, as I said, kind of irresistible. It's tabooed with lots of cultural prejudices about psychedelics themselves as being escapist, artificial, inauthentic, hedonistic, certainly not worthy of study. And I mentioned at the start that I'm involved in the creation of a master's program, Master's in Psychedelics and Consciousness Studies at the University of Ottawa. And support for this program comes from its association with psychology, with the health sciences. Absolutely, the Department of Religious Studies would not have endorsed this, their involvement with this, if it wasn't anchored in mental health. That is what gave it its hesher. That's what gave it its legitimacy. Not exploring these states in terms of spirituality. This is, I think, problematic. This is a prejudicial outlook towards non-ordinary states of consciousness that, and perhaps specifically psychedelics, that's incredibly self-defeating and damaging, at least for three reasons. First, this prejudice against non-ordinary states of consciousness appears oblivious to the fact that plant medicines and other techniques to cultivate non-ordinary states of consciousness have constituted an important part of humanity's ritual and religious traditions for millennia, ceremonially, and especially during rites of passage, and they continue to do so. So that's something that this taboo seems to overlook. Secondly, non-ordinary states of consciousness are at the very heart of religion. They should be our bailiwick, right? They should be our jurisdiction to examine. Ours, what I mean is religious studies scholars, humanities scholars. Some theorize about the role of non-ordinary states of consciousness in the very process of hominization, of becoming human, in the birth of symbolization, and in the emergence of religion. Others are engaged in salvage work, looking for clues about psychedelics in religious history. Notable here is the relatively new book by Brian Murarescu called The Immortality Key, where he argues that psychedelics were at the very heart of ancient religions, including Christianity. But this work and this type of work really remains on the periphery of mainstream academics. Some cognitive archaeologists argue that the human quest for transcendence, cultivated by techniques of non-ordinary states of consciousness with or without the catalyst of psychedelics, may in fact be the most important thing about us. That it's the engine behind early art, early architecture, and even behind perhaps the move from a nomadic existence to agriculture. Right? This may have been stimulated by hierophanies, these sacred manifestations in a particular place that would have justified staying put and all the difficult job that was of staying put and developing agriculture. So there's theories around this, that those non-ordinary states of consciousness are at the very heart of what it means to be human. The philosopher, again, more recently, the philosopher Jules Evans argues that efforts at self-transcendence or at the dissolution of the egoic chattering mind is a human universal. And such yearnings, he claims, are the font of all religions, as well as being the catalyst behind such things as extreme sports, raves, and recreational drug use. So the idea that the birth of religion and possibly hominization itself can be traced to non-ordinary states of consciousness and to its experiential core is actually an old idea. It was an assumption that underpinned much scholarship on religion in the 19th century and the early 20th century. These are really bold hypotheses that religious studies scholars could get involved with, could embark on research projects. The linguistic and social constructivist theories that dominate religious studies today are based, no doubt, on excellent scholarship, but they're much less bold, right? With these kinds of projects, we're carving out a much more modest, much meager terrain for religious studies scholarship. I think we can be bolder. The third and I would say even more important reason why the prejudice against non-ordinary states of consciousness is problematic is because it may be damaging to individuals' own psychedelic experiences. For instance, for those who have gone through clinical trials. Ignoring the metaphysics, the spiritual dimension, or trying to have those experiences fit the Procrustean bed of materialism is the most certain way to ensure that those experiences will not endure. Mainstream science operates within a paradigm of naturalistic materialism that is generally indifferent or maybe dismissive, at worst antagonistic to metaphysics. Also, until recently, it discredited dramatic spiritual experiences as deeply pathological. Indeed, one of the defining characteristics of modernity is its rejection of, I would say, explicit metaphysics, because of course it's also operating under metaphysics, but doesn't necessarily identify that, but its rejection of metaphysics, including religious beliefs in its search for truth, the constituents of which are understood to be uniquely material in nature. So liberal secular society, including law, the academy, medicine, evince the same discomfort with the non-material and prefer to locate agency within social and political dynamics, not spiritual ones. Until recently, therefore, the major institutions of modernity have sidelined religious experiences, either ignoring them outright, pathologizing them, or construing them as neurological or cultural linguistic byproducts. Within this context, psychedelic medicine's interest in spiritual experience is really remarkable. It's quite striking, it's quite surprising, and I would say encouraging. One begins to wonder if it might lead to a redefinition of the role of spirituality in medicine. Some are talking this talk now, and I think that that's possible, maybe, but it will depend, I think, on the involvement of humanities. I don't see it happening unless humanities is involved. Most psychedelic research remains focused on brain chemistry, where spiritual experiences are understood as epiphenomenon of more fundamental neuropharmacological processes. Within clinical settings, spiritual experiences are understood in terms of a therapeutic paradigm, as they ought to be for clinicians. But here, spirituality is interpreted as a mediating factor. Right, so spirituality is interpreted as a mediating factor, which, given the right set and setting, can stimulate a positive healing outcome. So in this view, spiritual experiences possess no epistemological significance, and their content is largely irrelevant. What matters is the degree to which that content, assumed to arise naturally from internal biochemical processes, is experienced as meaningful enough to produce a healing outcome. To cite Roland Griffin again, he says, although modern Western medicine doesn't typically consider spiritual or religious experiences as one of the tools in the arsenal against sickness, our findings suggest that these encounters often lead to improvements in mental health. So the findings suggest that, encountering the sacred can lead to mental health. Well, Griffin's words are encouraging. They seem to be oddly underwhelming, right? They don't capture the momentousness of the claims, which become subordinate actually to mental health. So encountering God, as it were, encountering the sacred becomes a mediating factor. It's great, it's great that you're talking to God, but how's the cigarette addiction? Are you still smoking, right? That becomes that's the healing outcome is the more important focus. So participants in psychedelic trials regularly claim that their experiences surpass the ordinary world of sense perceptions and make possible a direct perception of spiritual realities. They commonly describe their experiences as if it were a kind of revelation, delivered with such clarity and convincingness that it's taken to be unquestionably real. For many, it can lead to a sudden openness to spiritual possibilities that were previously unavailable. and can be the beginning of a creative invitation to new dimensions of existence. But much depends on what happens after the trip, after the journey, after the experience. Whether or not these experiences will germinate really depends on the soil. It needs a nurturing, rich soil in order for these experiences to take root. And this is why the post-trip integration is such a crucial part of psychedelic therapies, or it needs to be. Not enough attention is being placed on it. There's a lot of lip service around it, but its success really is highly dubious without this, highly dubious within a dominant frame that denies epistemological significance to transpersonal sources. So a powerful felt reality that the source of these new insights in one's life is non-anthropogenic in nature. In other words, that it's coming outside of oneself, clashes, right? It really clashes with our normative, everyday materialist worldview, which declares this to be impossible, frankly. And this can be startling and it can be confusing. And for some, the shift in worldview is so jarring that it can lead to what's called an ontological shock. And this is the language, in fact, that we're hearing in the literature. As an example, I'm not sure if my slides, yeah. In 2018, Rachel Patterson, who's an environmental consultant, entered a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins University, where she was given high doses of psilocybin, of magic mushrooms, to treat a major depressive disorder that she suffered from for most of her life. In the end, it was her materialist worldview and not, as it turns out, her depressive disorder that was affected by the psychedelic experience. Although the experience did not cure her of the depression, it seemed to shrink its significance. And in her words, it's not that my despair had diminished, the frame around it expanded. And in the vast, blessed blank space, I find divine okayness. The sense of being held by a great, ineffable beyond makes it easier to hold my own suffering and others. So how is this responded to? How is this treated within the clinical study? Right? She still has her depression. Was it a failure? And she talks about this in a number of online talks. Right? Did it work is the question. So yeah, it worked, but maybe not necessarily in the way that the study was set up to measure. Right? There's that assumption that these experiences should be blissful. There should be one powerful experience that transforms one's life. The sort of the dark nights are downplayed. They're not emphasized in the clinical literature. So it seems as though Peterson had an encounter with an external reality perceived as intelligent and purposeful, just as her clinical team hoped that she would. The encounter with the real appears to be decisive. The stronger the experience, the greater the therapeutic outcome. The research protocol is designed, in fact, to increase the likelihood of profound transpersonal experiences, but then, it can delegitimate them by depriving them of their epistemological significance. In this environment, it's highly unlikely that the experience can be sustained. Again, they need the rich soil to germinate. They need guidance along the path. And if these are really truly mystical experiences, as individuals who have them claim that they are, then we ought to be looking at the world's literatures, right, that have documented these mystical experiences. The religious traditions are storehouses of mystical states. All have accounts of challenges and awakenings, right? The challenges, though, are documented. Certainly, as it's articulated in the world's mystical literature, spiritual awakenings are not one-off experiences. That road to Damascus affair of St. Paul was not the norm, right? The norm is a much more difficult, a very long path. Instead, typically there are stages to spiritual awakening. The literature describes many one step forward, two steps backward. This is the St. John's dark night of the soul actually is quite common. And I think that the Jain tradition is revelatory here. I'd just like to circle back to Jainism. This is the tradition with at least 2,700 years of cultivating mental states characterized by equanimity and radical non-anthropocentrism, expansive ecological awareness, and compassion. Jainism asserts that deep introspective practices actually give rise to real insights into the nature of reality, and that they give real insights into pure self-awareness, what they call knowership, as well as give rise to an ethical orientation of radical nonviolence, which without that delegitimates the experience. It's not an experience of what's called samyak darshan in Jainism, of an insight, if one's ethical actions are continued to be unethical, right? Then it would invalidate that experience. It wouldn't be a valid mystical experience if one continued to behave unethically. But Jainism also warns that spiritual awakening can be difficult and it can go south, right, if not properly sustained and vigilantly maintained. One, in fact, can become a victim of one's own spiritual achievements. And this slide here is, I think it's depicted really for children in a comic book. Jains understand spiritual awakening as a long and difficult process. And I guess that's really what I want to mention. And I think that it's important that we study this. The world's religious literatures, mystical literatures, all say that, right? These are long and difficult processes, ultimately very worthy processes. The Jains understand spiritual awakening as a difficult process, characterized here as a ladder of 14 rungs. It's called the gunastanas, the sort of steps of quality or purification, steps or stages of purification. Each step along the way is difficult. The fourth step is called samyak darshan, and here you have it on the fourth. Samyak drishti, another term. It's that correct vision, that insight into the truth of nonviolence, right? It's kind of like a spiritual awakening, like a psychedelic opening. And awakening to the path of nonviolence, one feels compassion to the world around one. So again, it's quite similar to the sort of psychedelic breakthrough of through ego transcendence. But there are 10 more rungs to go, 10 more steps to go. And there's a lot of dangers. In fact, it's a minefield that Jains say we need to be very, very attentive to. The personality can suffer inflation, self-exaltation, grandiosity. And we need to take this seriously, right? We see this happening again and again. Not everybody who's consuming psychedelics becomes blissful and compassionate. Sometimes we see that ego inflation. The religious literature talks about this, right? In the language of Dr. Asajoli, the old Adam, the old surface, the old habits can resurface. In the Jain language, this would be due to one's ego, one's desire, one's violence, one's ignorance, right? That one can go all the way up here and then fall back down again, right? From the 11th. So the transition is often tumultuous. It's one that requires guidance. It's one that requires discipline. Jainism's introspective practices are understood to be techniques of karmic purification, but they help one along this path of self-realization. And they include such things as austerities and fasting, meditation, particularly a 48-minute meditation called samayik, absorbed state meditations, insight meditation, prakshadhyan, that comes out of the Terapanthi Jain community, a practice called kayotsur, of body abandonment. One actually kind of renounces the body, lies down and renounces the body in this practice. There's also contemplation on the bhavanas, just meditating or contemplating on the realities of existence. And there's also devotional surrender, or bhakti, or Jain bhakti, as an ideal of compassionate detachment embodied in the teachings. So the bhakti is also a way of surrendering or transcending the ego. Crucially, and I've already mentioned this, I think the non-ordinary states of consciousness are adjudged as veridical, as truthful within the Jain tradition, to the extent that they give rise to the practice of radical non-harm or non-violence, and that they inspire self-discipline, what's called samyak charitra. So insights from psychedelic therapy, I would argue, are unlikely to be singular events. Right? They're unlikely to take root unless integration is possible. Spiritual awakening is a long and difficult road, and certainly likely doomed to failure without that proper kind of integration. And I think that clinical studies, medicine cannot undertake this itself. This is something that needs to be done on a societal level. So in conclusion, in 1970, just a few years after his enthusiastic embrace of psychedelics, Houston Smith wrote a more tempered essay about psychedelic experiences. While he continued to insist on their spiritual significance, saying that the psychedelic experience can be religious and reports by subjects can be read like accounts of classic theophanies. Now he expressed doubts about their long-term value, both for the individual and for society. His critique was not leveled at the plant medicines themselves, but rather at, quote, Western models of the mind, which foreclose any serious engagement with spirituality, was his argument. He writes that the most important condition for the successful carryover of insights in psychedelic experiences is that of the conviction of their veracity, right? So an individual have that conviction in the early days after the experience, but can it be sustained, right? The conviction of their veracity. He predicted that this would be an uphill battle, as neither science nor mainstream religion is willing to consider the experiences as possessing epistemological value for different reasons, but neither are willing to consider that. So while the revival of psychedelic research has made discussion of spirituality more scientifically mainstream, it has thus far done nothing really to question the deeply rooted assumptions of modernity, nor has it challenged the rules of epistemological engagement. The absence of religious voices has limited the kinds of conversations possible and even robbed them of their far-reaching implications. And yet the ones to blame for this, I don't think are science, right? Religion and theology have colluded in the maintenance of the status quo by psychologizing psychedelic experiences and denying them any spiritual dimension. But it's not all doom and gloom. We have here, we're in the midst of this renaissance, of this psychedelic renaissance. There's also the emergence of contemplative studies. And certainly we're hearing more today about a commitment to, from our academies within the universities, to a commitment to epistemological re-evaluation, which calls attention to the limitations of methods developed in the European Enlightenment and scientific revolution. They need to be supplemented. Long-standing assumptions of how truth is generated are now being challenged, particularly with regards to what is and is not considered veridical. And this is stimulating interest in diverse ways of knowing and in the potential of non-ordinary states of consciousness. So just my last slide. I'm saying that this might lead us to explore introspective states as sites of potential knowledge, of real knowledge and insight. As such, if it does, it'll go beyond rationalist, objectivist, explanatory frameworks and contribute to a more, hopefully, to more epistemic humility and pluralism and ecological awareness. And I think that Jainism has much to offer in this conversation. It's a voice that I think needs to be heard. And the last slide here is of what's called the Sambasaran. It's the Jinnah preaching. And when the Jinnah, who is we could say a prophet within the Jain tradition, one who has attained that self-realization and now teaching the path of self-realization and of nonviolence. And in the Sambasaran, as the Jinnah preaches, it's a cosmic event. The whole cosmos is there to hear it, right? You see the gods and the goddesses and the laity and the ascetics and the animals. It's really a vision of reverence for the multiplicity of life. And that seems to be a vision that we're hearing being articulated in the psychedelic research. We're also finding it very strongly within Jainism. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Oh, please join me wherever you are right now in thanking Anne Vallely for taking on this task, helping us to think across claims that religious studies and Jain studies might be well suited to consider non-ordinary states of consciousness. And if this is transgressive, then I think you're confirming for me that the transgressive is often exceedingly generative. I don't even have the ability to put questions into the Q&A, but I have so many. So let's move on to questions. We'll continue on for at least 10 minutes right now, maybe even 12. And let's see, I'd like to introduce our moderator now. Dr. Daniele Piomelli holds the Louise Turner Arnold Chair in Neurosciences at UCI, where he's also Distinguished Professor of Anatomy and Neurobiology, Pharmacology, and Biological Chemistry. In addition to authoring 3 books and over 400 peer-reviewed articles in these fields and 34 patents, he's also the director of UCI's Center for the Study of Cannabis and editor-in-chief of Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research, the first peer-reviewed journal entirely dedicated to the study of cannabis, its derivatives, and their endogenous counterparts in the human body. Please continue to enter your questions into the Q&A box, and Dr. Piomelli will try to field as many of these as possible. And Dwayne, actually, if you're okay, I think we can try to go till 5:25. And those who can stay, please do. And if you need to depart, you'll get the video. Over to you, Daniele.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much for illuminating me and I assume the rest of the audience here. The questions that I'm looking at are fascinating as well. And I will start off with one by Andrew Bridges, and you will excuse me, everyone whose questions I will not be able to address. I am actually going to be pretty egocentric about this. I'm going to look at the questions that I find most exciting. Excuse me. But Andrew Bridges asks, epistemologically speaking, can we ever distinguish authentic from inauthentic spiritual experiences? I think you alluded to this, Dr. Vallely, when you raised several points in your presentation. Positions that stated that an experience that is induced by a psychedelic is inauthentic as opposed to an experience that is instead obtained through the more traditional means of, say, fasting and meditation. In fact, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about the work of Mircea Eliade, the Romanian-born French writer who has a whole book on this, the shamanism and the techniques of ecstasies, where he actually makes the point that the real deal are the mystical experiences that are obtained through classical means of fasting, etc. I happen to disagree with that position strongly, based on first of all ethnological considerations, but also scientific consideration. I think that Andrew Bridges' question is for you, of course, not for me, is particularly relevant in this context. Would you like to say a few words about it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. It's a difficult question, actually. It's one of the things that I grapple with as I try to work with scholars, both in religious studies as well as in theology, in trying to understand what do we mean by mysticism. And certainly those coming from the Abrahamic tradition have a lot of reservation about describing psychedelic experiences as authentic mysticism. And the reason is, again, the quote that I read to you from Stephen Katz, that sense of passivity is something that seems to be crucial, particularly within the Abrahamic traditions, right? As though something comes to us. It's not something that we can ever initiate, as though we can take a pill and meet God, that it has to be something passive. In fact, our understanding of religion would be something similar. Religion is not something that we can simply create ourselves. We're responding to something that's already in existence. So for theologians, it seems, I mean, of course, there's lots of diverse opinions within theology as well, but the mainstream view seems to be that as a result of that, because it's something that we would initiate through psychedelics, it's disqualified already as being an authentic. But who, again, I think the question is saying, who are we ever to say that? And in fact, the Jains also do a little bit of that, right? So I mentioned that according to the Jain tradition, it's a kind of, it's not a legitimate experience, not a legitimate spiritual experience. If one has had this state of samyak darshan, insight into reality, and then heads off to McDonald's, right? Eats a burger at McDonald's, that would invalidate that one has reached that state, that rung on the gunastanas. Now, for the person themselves, maybe who cares, right? But in terms of a collective communal understanding of what's going on, it would be invalidated on the basis of the fruits, right? And William James talks about that, the experience, but then the fruits of those experiences. How do they actually, when you get off the mat of the meditation mat and you go into society, that's really when we can judge the practice. It's such a complicated matter. I'd like to be able to adopt the idea that we have Christian mysticism and Jewish mysticism and entheogenic mysticism, or maybe even ayahuasca mysticism, and that mysticism is bigger category than any of these things. But it's not widely embraced, certainly not. I'm in constant dialogue and arguments, friendly arguments with colleagues about this. So I don't really have a good answer other than to say that I find it a challenging question.
It is indeed a challenging question. There is another question that I think is sadly related to this one, is by Manish Mehta. And the question is, can your definition of psychedelics be expanded to include converging technologies, capital C, capital T, i.e. a new field of science concerning the combination of nanobiocognitive IT, which aim at developing mind-altering systems for a myriad of positive outcomes? In other words, what Manish Mehta is saying is we can alter our consciousness in a variety of ways. Could be by traditional techniques, or could be by drugs, or could even be with new technologies. Is there a substantial difference across all these different approaches? I personally would argue that there is not. I think that I am on this probably on the pragmatic William James side. I think that at the end of the day, what matters is what you accomplish. But I would like perhaps to ask you, Dr. Vallely, what do you think about this?
Yeah, that's also quite fascinating. I want to resist that. I want to say, no, that's not how I understand mysticism. But again, it's, I think, coming back to how do I understand religion or spirituality, and I'm kind of lumping them together. I do feel as though there's a sense, including with psychedelics, that there's a response to something. So when I was saying a moment ago with Abrahamic tradition theologians, that external is a loving God, and it's only through God's grace, right, that one would have a spiritual experience. But within indigenous traditions that have used and continue to use plant-based medicines, there's a belief that the plant itself is a spirit, right, that it's divine. I mean, the ayahuasca is understood to be a goddess, and it's the goddess who is actually healing us. So we have the agency that we're consuming it, but it's not the plant, it's the spirit in the plant that's doing the healing. So we still have that kind of, we are responding to something external. And I think the way I like to think about religion and how it's different from culture is that phenomenologically, it's a kind of feeling of being responding to something external. So I want to say that's fascinating, that's cool, and maybe really valuable, but I want to distinguish that from mysticism because it's entirely a technique, right? It's entirely a technique that doesn't require any externality, any external entity at all. maybe a more conservative response. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would argue, however, that the main techniques of achieving ecstasies, including, as I said, fasting, but also, I don't know, for example, the swirling dances of the dervish, which you had a photograph of before, these are all involve the body.
Yeah.
I cannot think of any technique that does not involve a substantial amount of body exertion. And let's not forget that our body is external to our mind in a certain sense. That is, I like to go back to the definition that Edmund Husserl gives of Körper and Liebe, and Leib rather. If we fast and we induce a state in our mind through fasting, that is internal and at the same time is external. It's internal in the Körper and is external to the Leib, but it becomes internal to the Leib because the Körper has been involved. So I think these distinctions are important as they have to be done. The difficulty that we have as a scientist, you as humanists, is always to find a language that actually says something meaningful, because sometimes we use words that we take from other people and we don't use them correctly, and we don't think and then we don't discuss what those words actually mean. So this said, let me move on to the next question.
Right. I mean, I do agree with you that ultimately every experience that we have is a biochemical experience, right? Again, I'm invoke Paul on the road to Damascus. That too is a biochemical experience. We're all biological beings, so something is happening on that level of the corporate, right? But the lived experience, and again, many of the traditions like Jainism that are focused on fasting, it's understood, if we're understanding within its own terms, as a process of karmic purification, right? The fasting is actually shedding off karma so that the soul, the jiva, is becoming stronger. And so these techniques on the body are spiritual practices. One doesn't need an external God. The God is within, right, in the Jain tradition. And in the Sufism, the dance, of course, is a way of transcending ego so that one can connect with it's the silencing the mind through those practices so that one can connect with something, with Allah, with God.
Yeah, so a lot of very, very interesting question. I'm going to go to Carol Gerson, if you don't mind. I'm going to read it with you because the first three words really sound very interesting. In Zoharic Kabbalah, which is kind of an interesting of mine, and especially in Chabad Hasidism, the truth and structure of the psyche reiterate the same of the ineffable. Such a view allows that what we do to transform ourselves is legitimate, i.e. substance use. Do you think a Christian dualism, especially as evidenced by the parents, quote unquote, of the academic study of religion, i.e. Otto and Eliade, we're talking about my best friends, has moved the West to the dualistic view that substance facilitated mystical experiences are inauthentic? I'm sorry, I hope you saw that. You can probably see it on your screen.
Oh, can I see it also?
An interesting one as well, right?
It does. I'm not seeing. Oh, here we go.
And this is Rabbi Gary Gershon asking the question on Carol Gershon computer. Okay.
Oh, here we go. Chabad Hasidism, truths and structures of the psyche reiterate the same of the ineffable.
I think what Rabbi Gershon is saying, and I hope I don't misinterpret his thought, is that basically we in the West, which is already a phrase that I hate, but we say in this European tradition, do hold the Cartesian view that the world is made of mind and body. Those are irreconcilable in many ways. Whereas in Jewish mysticism, in the Kabbalah, this may not be. This is not the case. So perhaps I think what Rabbi Gershon is suggesting is that there is in Chabad Hasidism and in the Zoharic Kabbalah, we could find a place where religion and the religious view of mysticism and a more psychedelically driven view of mysticism could find some kind of a common ground. I'm probably butchering the
No, it's fascinating.
question, but that's my limited understanding of it.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I don't know that I have anything to say to it other than that it's fascinating. Is it the understanding here that everything in the natural world is that we are sort of on a path towards progress, again, understood within Abrahamic traditions, and therefore, as we manipulate the natural world or we manipulate our bodies, it's part of a divine plan? Would that be sort of the subtext of some of this, that there's nothing outside of the realm of spirituality, that there's no, I'm not sure I'm following entirely the question, but
I think that is what I think, that's where I think the question is going. I should have read it through a couple of times before asking it, because it is a tough question.
No, it's one that I'd like to chew over.
Much time. So I'm going to move on to another question if we have time, Dr. Donaldson. Do we?
Yes, I think we have time, but I wonder if you could, I'd like you to include, I saw that Lydia Lutiola had a question, and I wonder if you could include that with whatever question you choose all at once, Daniela, and then Anne can answer them both together, and then we can wrap up.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize that there were so many more questions coming out. So,
and will I get to hold on to those questions? Will I get?
Yes, I will say.
I'd love to, because there's that one I'd love to chew over. Yeah.
We have a couple of yes, thank you from Rabbi Gershon. So it looks like we didn't completely go outside of that is good. I think also Manish Mehta had some more comments, but I want to go to Lydia Luciola. I think that's the pronunciation of the name. If I'm less,
Thank you.
No, I mean, it's an Italian name, so at least that one I should know, right? So thank you for your summarization of the Jain tradition. In our travels abroad with Dr. Chapple to study the tradition, I don't remember discussions around achieving altered state from psychedelic herbs, which I think you said, Dr. Vallely, in the Jain material, as it is referred in Patanjali's Sutra text. Is there any reference to plant-based medicine in any of the Jain texts that you are aware of? I heard you say no, but
no, yeah, that's a question. I'm glad that there's that Chris Chappell's on the Zoom, and I see that Stephen Vos is as well. You know, I don't know. I don't think that there are. Certainly, I don't think that there are psychedelics. But that's what I said. Also, I don't want to overdetermine this in case there are Jains to disabuse me of this idea. I don't know, right? I certainly think it's unlikely, because of course Jain practice, when it's done as a Jain practice, when it's a spiritual practice, it's the giving up of something rather than the consumption of something. And so if it was used, and again, it's kind of interesting with that medical framing, I think that of course Jains will consume plants for medicinal value. But in terms of a spiritual path, I think that would be highly unlikely, and I would be surprised, and I'd love to hear from others what they thought about that, right? Because that to me seems, there's that question of intoxicants, that one will not be as focused, and one needs to be very observant of where one walks and talks and sits and so on. But also the plant is a living being, it has a soul. And so if I'm consuming it and I don't need to for nourishment, then it might be construed as unnecessary violence. But that's, again, my assumption, not, I'd love to hear from others if there's somebody on the Zoom who knows more.
Chris, do you want to weigh in here briefly?
Just to the extent that some Ayurvedic concoctions may have a salutary effect, or at least a calming effect, that might be part of sort of the broader Indian culture. But unlike where we see the not yogis and their chillums and the whole experience of marijuana that's very closely bound with those yogis that are well documented, I've never seen anything like that practice within Jain communities. I'm wondering if Sushma may have something to say on this.
Yeah, I think I can talk a little bit about the plant medicine and how it's related to consciousness and the body. So according to Jainism, right, body, mind, all this is matter, which is a jiv, non-living, while the soul is living, or jiv. So the plant medicine, whatever we consume, actually we are feeding our body. So which is separate, completely two substances are separate from each other. It can be instrumental cause to affect the consciousness or the inherent qualities of consciousness, bringing the calming effect or having that peace manifested within the soul, but it's not directly impacting. So one is an instrumental cause, and the principal cause is nothing but the virtues of the soul. Like Stevens wrote down here somewhere that mind and the body, they're all the non-living, the physical matter. So whatever psychedelics or whatever we are talking about is basically, we are talking about the impact on the mind and the body and all that, which is a separate entity really. It's a non-living separate entity, but it could be, it is an instrumental cause. Like if we have a catalyst, right? When we do any science experiment, that catalyst can impact the result, but the catalyst doesn't do directly anything. The same thing, I think, I haven't studied much of psychedelics or anything, but listening to you, Annie, what I think is that is more impacting the mind and body, which is an instrumental cause to affect the peace, happiness, which are the virtues of the soul, the knowledge, perception, happiness, all these are virtues of the soul, and it's indirectly impacting that. But according to Jainism, one substance does not impact the other substance directly. So it's an instrumental cause.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. Really
Yeah,
excellent.
but I think we're at time. And I wonder if there's a connection there with that Brianne Peterson, when you said, as Sushma's description of, the direct cause is actually the qualities of the jiva itself, right? So that you're not kind of, you're changing the frame, but allowing sort of the internal qualities to have greater access or something. I just saw a connection.
Yeah.
Dr. Oh yeah, go ahead, Anne. You can get the last word. And okay, and we'll just take 30 seconds for each of you, and then we'll close. Dr. Piomelli, and you go, and then Anne goes.
Yeah, sorry, very, very quickly. So referring to Brianne Peterson's citation, it reminded me of an interesting fact from clinical trials on cannabis, where people have given, different cannabis preparations, obtaining, for example, to folks with multiple sclerosis, and the outcome, the major outcome of the study, which was, a bunch of parameters that are related to multiple sclerosis, was negative. But so no result. But every participant to the study would say, "But I felt better." But I felt better. So I was still stiff, but I felt better. That is rephrasing what Brianne Peterson says in her citation. I like to put it there for you to think about the fact that sometimes we don't appreciate our pharmacology actually already has these things and is not interpreting them correctly. And that's where I think the humanist perspective must come in play and help, the hard-nosed scientists to put things in context.
Yeah. No, actually refers back to what you were saying a moment ago, is again about the two different understandings of the body. The body is body, the body is the corpor, and the lived body. And I found that quote by Brianne Peterson quite fascinating, right? And I've heard her talk about it quite a bit. She's still feeling the suffering. She's still suffering, but that it's occupying a smaller space in her life now, right? And so she's gained a sort of purchase from it, whereas before it controlled her. So what I raise that question is, what do we do with that kind of stuff? Whereas I think her outcome would be considered a failure within the clinical trial. She's still depressed, right? She's still depressed.
We need better clinical studies with better outcomes.
Yeah.
That's the only thing there is.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all so much. I actually am so thrilled with this conversation and the questions, and we will save them all. And some of them I know you know personally, so you can follow up. But thank you all so much for joining us to think with Jain studies and the role of religious studies in producing alternate futures. And thank you, Dr. Piomelli, for your moderation. Our next lecture in this Religious Studies in Producing Alternate Future series will be February 21st, 2022. And Michelle, if you could drop that information in the chat. This will feature Dr. Anthony Pinn from Rice University, who will give the talk Binding Blacks, W.E.B. Du Bois and Albert Camus on Engaging the World. And I hope you will continue to join as we vivify the significance of religious studies at UCI as essential for thinking about alternative futures across disciplines. And look for a follow-up email in the next few days with a link for today's video and Q&A. Thank you again, Anne Vallely. Thank you for joining Key Chapple and all of our friends at LMU, Sushama Parekh, Dean Miller. It's been great to have you here, and all of you who have joined us. Take care as you go, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Jai Jinendra.
Jai Jinendra.